Welcome back, and let your body grow heavy and warm wherever you are resting tonight. Breathe out slowly, and let the whole day loosen its hold on you, far beyond the asteroids, in the cold and quiet outer reaches of our solar system. An enormous striped planet turns in the dark, and around it drifts a small white moon wrapped in smooth pale ice. Beneath that ice, held in perfect blackness, lies an ocean deeper than any on Earth, rocking gently since long before the first living thing appeared on our world. Its name is Europa. Tonight we will drift out to it together, one soft fact at a time. There is nothing to solve and nothing to carry. Just breathe and let go, and welcome back to Beyond the Stars. The first fact is that Europa is a moon of the planet Jupiter. Not a bare gray rock like our own moon, but a smooth white world wrapped entirely in ice, with a saltwater ocean hidden beneath it. There is nothing quite like it anywhere else within our reach. It is one of the very few places we know of, beyond the Earth itself, where liquid water exists in enormous quantity right now, tonight while you lie there resting. Everything about it is quiet. It makes no sound. It sends us no signal, and nothing we have ever built has touched its surface. It simply turns around Jupiter in the cold and the dark, patient and pale and waiting. The second fact is that Europa is almost exactly the size of our own moon, only a little smaller. Its diameter measures 3,122 kilometers, while the familiar moon that lights our own night sky measures 3,475. The difference between them is slighter than you might expect from two worlds so utterly unalike. If you could set the two side by side in the dark, they would look like near twins in size, and yet one is dry and gray and dusted with craters, while the other is white and glassy and holds a hidden sea. Two bodies of nearly the same measure, and two entirely different destinies. The third fact is that Europa is the smallest of the four great moons that circle Jupiter, the ones astronomers call the Galilean moons, Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, for worlds so large that any one of them would be counted a planet if it happened to orbit the Sun alone. Even as the smallest of that family, Europa still ranks as the sixth largest moon in the entire solar system, out of the hundreds upon hundreds we have counted. It is small only in the company it keeps, set against the countless little irregular rocks that circle the giant planets. It is a genuine world in its own right, modest among giants, and enormous among the rest. The fourth fact is that Europa was discovered in January of 1610 by Galileo Galilei, in the very first weeks that anyone on Earth had ever pointed a telescope at the night sky in earnest. He was working in Padua with an instrument he had built with his own hands, little better than a modern pair of opera glasses, and he turned it toward the bright wandering star we call Jupiter. What he saw beside it would change the shape of human thought forever. In a few cold January nights of careful watching, for new worlds were quietly added to the known universe, and none of them belonged to us. The fifth fact is that what Galileo actually saw was nothing dramatic at all, only 3 or 4 faint points of light arranged in a neat little line beside the bright disk of Jupiter. He assumed at first that they were ordinary background stars that happened to lie in the same direction. But he came back the following night, and the small points had moved. He came back again, and they had shifted once more, some slipping to one side of the planet and some vanishing behind it altogether. Night after patient night, he sketched their changing places in his notebook until the pattern became undeniable. They were going around. The sixth fact is that this quiet discovery brought an entire way of understanding the heavens gently to an end. For many centuries it had been taught that everything in the sky turned about the Earth, that we were the single still center of all motion. Here in one small telescope were 4 objects plainly circling something else entirely. They did not care about the Earth at all. The evidence was not an argument or a theory, but a simple thing that anybody could go outside and see for themselves. And so a handful of moving specks beside Jupiter helped shift the ground beneath our feet forever. And one of those specks was Europa. The seventh fact is that Europa carries the name of a figure from ancient Greek myth, a young woman of Phoenicia whom the god Zeus admired from far away. In the old story, he took the shape of a gentle white bull and lay down among her father's herds. And when Europa climbed onto his back, he carried her away across the sea to the island of Crete. The Romans called that same god Jupiter. And so the great planet and the small moon are bound together by a tale far older than any telescope. Each of the Galilean moons is named for a companion of Jupiter in those stories, a family gathered out of legend. The eighth fact is that Galileo himself did not choose those names, and for a long while the four moons were known only by numbers. He preferred to call them the Medicean stars, in honor of his wealthy patrons in Florence, and referred to them simply as the first, the second, the third, and the fourth. The names we use today came from a German astronomer named Simon Marius, who observed the same moons at very nearly the same time and suggested drawing them from mythology. His idea was set aside for centuries, and Europa was written in the books as Jupiter too. Only much later did the old names quietly win and settle in for good. The ninth fact is that Europa completes one full circle around Jupiter in only 3.5 days, sweeping along at a distance of roughly 671,000 kilometers from the great planet's cloud tops. That is a little farther than the gap between the Earth and our own moon, and yet the journey takes days rather than weeks, because Jupiter is so enormously heavy that everything near it must hurry. In the time it takes you to forget an ordinary week, Europa has gone around twice. The whole year of that little world is shorter than most of our errands. A small bright life, lived very quickly. The 10th fact is that Europa keeps one face turned toward Jupiter at all times, exactly as our moon keeps one face turned toward the Earth. Astronomers call this synchronous rotation, and it comes about because the tides raised by a heavy planet slowly break a moon's spin until the two motions match and settle into step. From the ice of Europa, Jupiter would therefore hang in one fixed place in the sky, and never rise and never set, however long you waited. Half of that world sees the giant planet always, and the other half has never seen it at all. A hemisphere that has never once looked up at Jupiter. The 12th fact is that Europa is the second of the four Galilean moons counting outward from Jupiter, tucked between fiery Io on the inside and huge Ganymede on the outside. Io is a world of endless volcanoes, painted in yellows and sulfurous oranges, forever torn and reworked by the giant's pull. Ganymede beyond is the largest moon in the entire solar system, broader even than the planet Mercury. Callisto sits farthest out, dark and heavily cratered and very old. Europa lies between the fire and the deep ice of that little family, in the one place where the balance came out gently, warm enough and cold enough at once. The 13th fact is that Jupiter with all its moons is very nearly a small solar system of its own. The giant planet holds a family of dozens upon dozens of satellites, most of them tiny captured rocks tumbling along strange and distant paths, and 4 of them true worlds with landscapes and histories. When Galileo first watched those 4 points of light circle their bright master, he was watching a miniature model of the very thing being argued over at the time, a system of bodies orbiting a central mass. The whole shape of the heavens was there in the eyepiece, in small, quietly turning and quietly true. The 14th fact is that Europa is built in layers, rather like an egg or like the Earth itself. At the center lies a dense core of iron and rock, and around that a thick mantle of ordinary silicate stone, much like the deep rock beneath our own continents. Above the stone lies the water, a shell of it wrapping the entire world, and the outermost part of that shell is frozen solid into the smooth, bright crust we see. So the visible surface of Europa is not the surface of the moon at all, only the frozen skin of its ocean, a lid rather than a ground. The 15th fact is that we know Europa is mostly rock, and not a ball of ice all the way through because of how heavy it is for its size, by watching how strongly a passing spacecraft is pulled off course. Astronomers can weigh a moon quite precisely, and dividing that weight by its volume gives its density. Europa comes out far too dense to be made of ice, and lands instead close to the density of ordinary stone. The water, for all its importance, makes up only the outer wrapping of the world. It is a rock moon in a coat of sea, and the coat is what makes it remarkable. The 16th fact is that you can go outside and see Europa for yourself on almost any clear night when Jupiter is above the horizon. An ordinary pair of binoculars, held steady against a fence or a door frame, will show the planet as a small bright disk with 2 or 3 or 4 tiny points of light strung out in a line beside it. Those points are the Galilean moons, and one of them is the ocean world. You will be seeing exactly what Galileo saw with better glass and for centuries of understanding behind your eyes. The same faint lights in the same quiet order. The 17th fact is that Europa belongs to a category astronomers have only lately begun to speak of, the ocean worlds. For most of our history, we assumed that seas were a rare and precious peculiarity of the Earth. Now we suspect that liquid water may be quite ordinary in the outer solar system, hidden under crusts of ice on Enceladus at Saturn, on Titan, on Ganymede and Callisto, perhaps even on distant Pluto. Not one of those oceans has a sky. Every one of them is sealed away in the dark. And of that whole quiet family, Europa is the one that seems most promising, and by far the easiest for us to reach. The 18th fact is that Europa sits very near the top of nearly every list astronomers make of the best places to search for life beyond the Earth. It is not the only candidate, and it may not even be the likeliest one, but it is the place where the essential ingredient is least in doubt. We are reasonably certain the water is there. We are reasonably certain it has been there a very long time. Everything beyond that remains an open and gentle question. That mixture of near certainty and complete mystery is exactly what draws people to spend whole careers upon it. A question worth a lifetime. The 19th fact is that Europa has quietly changed what we mean when we speak of a habitable place. The older idea imagined a narrow ring of comfortable distance around a star, where a world could keep water on its surface without freezing or boiling away, and by that measure the outer solar system was simply dead. Europa does not sit anywhere near that ring, and yet it holds an ocean. If warmth can come from tides rather than from sunlight, then the number of possible homes for life in the universe grows enormously, and the cold, dark places stop looking empty. The 20th fact is that there is something quietly moving in the thought of a small white moon that has been circling that giant planet for 4.5 billion years, keeping an entire ocean warm and dark and undisturbed the whole while no one watched it for almost all of that time. No eye saw the cracks open. No ear heard the ice shift and settle. Simply carried on, faithfully, going around and around in the cold. As you sink deeper into the dark tonight, you might picture that patient little world still turning out there, exactly as it did last night and will again tomorrow. The 21st fact is that the ground beneath every marking on Europa is not stone at all, but water, frozen into a shell that wraps the entire globe without a single gap. If you could set your hand upon those plains, you would be touching the same substance that fills the seas of our own world, only held still and pale in the deep cold of Jupiter's neighborhood. There is no continental rock, no sand, no soil, nothing of the mineral crust that we call land at home. The whole face of that moon is made of the most ordinary and most precious thing we know: water, wearing the shape of a world. The 22nd fact is that extreme cold utterly changes the nature of ordinary ice. Near the equator, the surface rests at about 160 degrees below 0 Celsius, and near the poles it falls to about 220 degrees below zero, and at temperatures like those the ice no longer behaves the way it does in our warm and careless hands. It stops being soft and slippery and becomes something closer to granite, hard enough to hold cracks and ridges for ages without slumping. A pick struck against it would ring rather than sink. The ocean of Europa wears a roof of stone, and that stone is only frozen water, patient and immensely strong. The 23rd fact is that Europa is one of the most reflective bodies anywhere in the solar system, a surface that throws back the greater part of the sunlight, reaching it rather than swallowing it away into darkness. Most worlds we have visited are dusty, charcoal-colored things that absorb the light and quietly keep it. This moon does the opposite. It gleams, set beside the scorched gray of our own moon, which drinks in nearly everything that lands upon it and gives back only a little. Europa looks almost luminous, a pale marble held up against the blackness of an enormous room, a bright coin turning slowly in the dark. The 24th fact is that the reason for that brightness is simple, and it is one of the loveliest things about the moon. The ice there is fresh and it is clean. On most airless worlds, the surface lies buried under the powdered rubble of countless impacts and darkened by long exposure to space, so that every plane grows dim and gray with age, century upon century. Europa keeps renewing its face faster than the darkening can ever take hold. New ice arrives from below, spreading and refreezing, laying down bright material again and again. What you see when the sunlight strikes it is not an ancient surface at all. It is something recently made. The 25th fact is that of every solid surface we have ever seen anywhere, Europa's is the smoothest. Not merely smooth for a moon, not merely gentler than the battered and cratered worlds around it, but the flattest solid ground that is known to us in all our surveying of the sky. If you shrank that whole globe down to something you could cradle in your palm, the ridges and the cracks would feel like the faintest tracery under your fingertips, less than the texture of an eggshell. Astronomers reached for that comparison the moment the measurements arrived, because nothing else quite carried the sense of it. A world polished smooth. The 26th fact is that such flatness leaves a landscape stripped of everything we expect from mountainous country. There are no ranges rising in long blue chains toward a distant horizon, no lonely peaks catching the first light of morning, no deep canyons where a river has spent an age carving patiently downward through layered rock. Nothing there stands tall enough to cast the kind of shadow a mountain casts across a valley at evening on Earth. The features that do exist are broad and low, ridges measured in modest rises rather than in soaring heights, spread across enormous distances. It is scenery without altitude, wide, and wonderfully level. The 27th fact is that the strangeness of it is best felt by comparing the whole globe to the world outside your window. On Earth, the difference between the deepest ocean trench and the highest summit is a great and dizzying span, and even the gentlest countryside rolls and dips and rises beneath your feet as you cross it. Europa's entire surface varies in height by remarkably little from one side of the moon to the other. Every plane lies at nearly the same level as every other plane. The flattest field you have ever walked across at dusk would still be rougher than that quiet white expanse, smoother than any calm you know. The 28th fact is that the moment of first understanding arrived suddenly, when the earliest close images came back and the scientists gathered around them found something they had not prepared themselves to see. They had expected a battered, pockmarked little world, because that is what small icy moons almost always look like. What arrived instead was a bright globe crossed by delicate lines, nearly featureless in relief, with nothing standing up from it at all. It looked less like a landscape and more like a drawing, or a cracked glaze on a piece of fine porcelain. Astonishment is not too strong a word for that first sight. A quiet, disbelieving wonder. The 29th fact is that craters, which are the common currency of every other airless world we know, are almost entirely missing here. Look at our own moon through even a small telescope and you will find rings inside rings, basins upon basins, a face saturated with the record of everything that ever struck it across billions of years. Turn that same patient attention to Europa and you will count only a handful of proper craters across the entire globe, a scattering so sparse that each one has been given a name and studied on its own. The blows must have come. The evidence simply is not there, erased somehow and gone. The 30th fact is that astronomers have a tool for making sense of such an absence, and it is beautifully simple. Space is full of wandering debris, and over long stretches of time that debris arrives at a fairly steady pace. So any surface left undisturbed will slowly accumulate craters the way dust settles on a shelf in a quiet room. Count the craters over a given area, and you are reading a clock. The more crowded the surface, the longer it has lain untouched. The emptier it looks, the more recently something has wiped it clean. It is the nearest thing planetary science has to counting the rings of a tree, a clock written in impacts. The 31st fact is that the conclusion following from that clock is the one which changed how we think about this moon entirely. When the crater clock is read on Europa, it returns a surprisingly small number. The visible surface appears to be only tens of millions of years old, which sounds enormous until you set it beside the moon itself, which formed billions of years ago alongside Jupiter and its companions. The face is a tiny fraction of the age of the body that wears it. Nearly the whole history of that world has been rubbed out and written over. What we see is the newest page, an ancient moon with a young face. The 32nd fact is that something must be doing the erasing, continually and patiently, over spans of time far longer than our species has existed anywhere on Earth. A surface does not stay young by accident. Craters are being softened, filled, cracked apart and quietly swallowed, and new material is being laid down where the old material used to lie, again and again, in a cycle that has clearly never stopped. Europa is repaving itself. The whole white shell is a work in progress, resurfaced by forces working from beneath rather than from above, and the smoothness we admire is simply the freshest coat, the newest layer still settling. The 33rd fact is that this ice shell, somewhere between 15 and 25 kilometers thick, is the bedrock of that entire world. It is the floor you would stand upon, the foundation on which any future lander would come to rest its whole weight, the solid ground in every sense that matters there. Beneath it lies not more rock but water, dark and deep and unlit, and above it nothing but the thinnest breath of gas. So the ground is a lid, a frozen ceiling drawn over an ocean, and yet it holds ridges and cracks the way granite holds mountains at home. Solid ground, made of sea. The 34th fact is that the light there has a quality entirely its own. Jupiter lies far enough from the sun that daylight in that part of the solar system is a dim and gentle thing, only a small fraction of the brightness that floods an ordinary afternoon on Earth. The sun there is no longer a disk you must look away from. It is a small brilliant point, fierce and tiny, casting long clean shadows across the ice without ever warming it. Everything would be lit the way a winter dawn is lit, pale and level and faintly blue, bright enough to see by and no more. The 35th fact is that Europa circles Jupiter once every 3.5 days, at a distance of about 671,000 kilometers, and it turns upon its own axis in exactly that same span, keeping one face always turned patiently toward the great planet. because the spin and the orbit are locked together in that patient agreement. The length of a day there equals the length of the year, in a manner of speaking. Noon does not come around each morning as it does for us. Sunrise, midday, sunset, and the long night together fill those 3.5 days. One slow breath of light. The 36th fact is that the line between day and night creeps across that ice. The Terminator, moving so gradually that you could walk beside it all afternoon without ever needing to hurry. On Earth, the shadow of evening sweeps over the land and the water far faster than any traveler on foot could ever hope to follow it. There it merely drifts, a soft gray border easing westward across the plains hour after hour, drawing the shadows of every low ridge out into long dark fingers before folding them quietly away. Dawn would take what feels like a whole season to arrive, light returning at the pace of patience. The 37th fact is that a delicate frost settles there. Water molecules drift slowly up from the surface, wander a while in the emptiness above it, and settle back down again, dusting the plains with a fine crystalline coating far cleaner than any snow that falls at home. When the low sunlight catches that coating at a shallow angle, it would glitter, throwing back tiny points of brilliance from every facet. A whole horizon quietly sparkling. There is no wind to drift it into banks, no warmth at all to melt it into crust. It simply lies where it settles, undisturbed, waiting through the long cold day, a shimmer laid over silence. The 38th fact is that Europa is best imagined from a distance, drifting far enough back that the whole moon fits comfortably in your view. What hangs there before you is a pale and rounded globe, softly white and faintly golden in places, with a webbing of thin dark lines running across it in every direction, curving and crossing and fading gently around the limb. The most common comparison is a cracked marble, or a bright egg with a fine mesh of fractures traced upon the shell. It is one of the most immediately recognizable objects in the solar system, and one of the quietest to look at, beautiful and strangely still. The 39th fact is that the ground between those dark markings is not glassy ice but something soft and powdery, closer to old snow that has been sitting quietly undisturbed in one place for a very long time indeed. Countless small impacts and the steady patter of charged particles arriving from Jupiter work together to grind the topmost layer into a fine and very loose material, so a boot pressed carefully into it would sink a little and leave a clean print behind. Those plains stretch on for enormous distances, unbroken, unmarked, faintly luminous beneath the little sun and the black sky above. A snowfield with no footprints in it. The 40th fact is that there is a peculiar gentleness to a world with no mountains at all. We are used to landscapes that argue with us, that rise and block the way and demand a good deal of climbing, and we quietly take that struggle to be simply what a surface is. Europa offers something else entirely. A globe where you could set out in any direction you liked and simply keep going, over level ice, under a black sky, with the horizon always the same soft distance away. Nothing there towers, nothing there overhangs, nothing there looms. It is the most peaceful terrain we know of anywhere, a world that has forgotten how to rise. The 41st fact is that the dark markings crossing Europa have a name of their own, the linei, which is simply the Latin word for lines, and they are without question the single defining feature of that gleaming face. They run in every direction across the globe, some faint and hair-thin, others broad and heavy enough to be seen from very far away, overlapping and interrupting one another in a tangle that covers the entire moon. No region is free of them. Wherever a spacecraft has looked closely, more of them appear, finer and fainter, down to the smallest scale the cameras can resolve. A world entirely written upon. The 42nd fact is that they look uncannily familiar, which is part of why they both unsettle and delight the people who study them. Look at an image of that moon and your eye insists on reading the pattern as cracks in an eggshell that someone has tapped gently and then set back down again. Others see the veins beneath pale skin, or the branching lines of a leaf held up to the light, or the long fractures spreading through a sheet of glass that has been struck but has not yet fallen. The comparisons come easily because we have all seen something break this gently familiar at an impossible scale. The 43rd fact is that the sheer extent of the lineae is difficult to hold in the mind. These are not local features, not the modest cracks that spread across a frozen pond on a cold morning. A single band can run for a distance far greater than the length of any mountain chain on Earth, curving steadily onward, holding its width, wrapping a good part of the way around the entire moon before finally fading or meeting another and stopping. To walk one from end to end would be to circle most of a world. Nothing in our own geography reaches so far unbroken. One crack and a whole horizon. The 44th fact is that many of the largest markings, seen in the closer images, are not simple lines at all but triple bands, which reveal themselves only when you look carefully and patiently. Each one carries two dark parallel edges with a paler stripe running neatly between them, like a ribbon of clean, bright ice bordered on either side by something darker that has stained the surrounding ground. From far away, the three parts blur together into a single dark stroke. Up close they separate, and the structure becomes plain, repeated faithfully along the whole enormous length of the band. A seam with bright thread down the middle. The 45th fact is that a finer and quieter structure appears again and again all over the moon, in region after region. Many of the lines are actually double ridges, two low parallel rises with a small shallow valley cradled between them, running side by side for great distances without ever wandering apart or losing their shape. The pair holds its spacing with remarkable discipline, as though something opened along that seam and pushed material up evenly on both sides. Walk along the little trough between them and you would have gentle white walls to your left and right the whole way, a road with soft banks. The 46th fact is that the strangest of all the markings is also the most telling. Some of the lines do not run straight but arc instead in long scalloped loops, one graceful curve joining the next in a chain that repeats across the ice for great distances, and these are called cycloids. Their shape is not decoration. A crack opening under a steadily shifting pull will wander in exactly that looping way, and the rhythm of the loops matches the rhythm of the tides raised by Jupiter as the moon swings through its short orbit. The ice records the pulling as a signature, the tide drawn in curves. The 47th fact is that these markings give us a sense of order in time, which is a rare and precious thing to find in such distant places. Where one band crosses another, the younger interrupts the older, cutting cleanly through it and offsetting it slightly, exactly as a newer scratch crosses an older scratch on a pane of glass. By tracing which lines are broken and which run unbroken, patient eyes can sort the whole tangle into layers of before and after. It becomes a sequence, a history laid out flat and readable across the ice, without a single date attached to any of it. An order of events, quietly preserved. The 48th fact is that in true and careful color, the freshest and busiest markings are not black at all, as the earliest pictures suggested. They carry a warm reddish-brown tint, rusty and soft and low, standing out gently against the clean white of the broad plains around them. The oldest and faintest lines tend toward paler shades, while the youngest and most active regions hold the deepest color of all. It is a gentle, dusty red, more like clay or dried cinnamon than anything fiery. Against the surrounding brightness, those stained lines give the moon its distinctive look, white ice, veined with warmth. The 49th fact is that the explanation for that lovely color begins with salt. Careful study of the light reflected back to us from the stained regions suggests the presence of salts, minerals of exactly the kind that would naturally dissolve into a great body of water sitting against a rocky floor for a very long time. Where the crust has opened, briny material appears to have risen and dried onto the surface, leaving its residue behind for us to notice. It is the same everyday chemistry that leaves white rings along a shore when seawater retreats and evaporates, only worked upon a colder and far larger canvas. The sea, leaving traces. The 50th fact is that another contribution to the color comes from somewhere else entirely, from a neighboring world that never rests. Io, the innermost of the 4 great moons, is covered in restless volcanoes that throw sulfur-rich material high above its surface, and some of that material escapes into a vast, tenuous cloud that circles Jupiter itself. Over truly enormous spans of time, a small portion of it drifts slowly outward and settles gently onto Europa's ice, mixing into the uppermost surface layer. So one moon quietly dusts another. Across a distance we would find almost unimaginable, in a slow exchange that has never once paused. A gift, arriving grain by grain. The 51st fact is that radiation is also at work, and it is the finishing touch upon the whole gentle palette of that world. Jupiter is wrapped in enormous belts of energetic charged particles that sweep past Europa continually, striking the surface and rearranging the chemistry of whatever happens to lie exposed there. Fresh salts and sulfur compounds, pale and bright when they first arrive there, are steadily altered by that bombardment and grow darker and redder as the long ages pass. The color deepens with time, which means the shade of any given marking tells you something about how long it has been sitting in the open age, written as color. The 52nd fact is that one implication makes scientists lean closer to the images and study them all over again. If the stains along the youngest cracks really are salts carried up from a hidden ocean, then the surface is not merely a lid resting over that water. It is a record of it. Every reddish line is a place where the deep sea has left a mark upon the outside of the world, a sample delivered upward without our having to drill for it. The ocean, unreachable beneath many kilometers of ice, is quietly signing its name where we can read it. The deep, writing on the shell. The 53rd fact is that one kind of terrain carries a name suiting it well, chaos terrain, and it interrupts the smooth and orderly plains and patches scattered across the moon. Within these regions, the orderly lines break down completely and give way to something else. The ground becomes a jumble of angular blocks of ice, some tilted, some rotated, some sunk lower than their neighbors, all of them set into a rougher matrix of finer material. The contrast with the surrounding calm is immediately striking, as though a small area of the world had been stirred while everything around it stayed perfectly still. A patch of disorder in a quiet field. The 54th fact is that chaos terrain is easiest to understand by picturing the surface of a frozen sea in spring, when the long cold at last begins to loosen its hold. A solid sheet of ice does not shatter randomly when it starts to break. It parts into rafts and plates that drift a little, turn a little, and then lock together again when the cold returns, leaving their edges no longer matching one another. That is precisely what these regions look like. Individual blocks can be fitted back together in the mind, showing how far each one moved before it froze in place again, broken and then healed. The 55th fact is that the most famous example of all is a modest region called Connemara Chaos, which has become the one picture everyone reaches for when explaining this curious landscape to someone new. It shows the jumbled blocks with unusual clarity, each raft standing distinct against the rougher ground between them, tilted at its own particular angle and still holding fragments of the old ridged surface upon its top. The name comes from Connemara, a rugged and beautiful stretch of coast in the west of Ireland. chosen for the way its broken shoreline echoes the pattern in the ice. An Irish name, given to a Jovian shore. The 56th fact is that much of this moon's charm lies in the gentle way everything upon it has come to be named. The convention drawn up for Europa reaches into Celtic myth and into the older stories of the Mediterranean. So the features there carry the names of figures drawn from Irish and from Welsh legend, and of places bound up with the tale of Europa herself, the young woman carried across the sea in the story that gave this moon its name. The final result is a map that reads very much like a book of old tales, laid gently across a world of ice, myth, spread over frozen ground. The 57th fact is that another family of features, a good deal smaller and gentler than the chaos regions, goes by the pleasant name lenticulae, a word that simply means freckles. These are rounded shapes scattered across the plains, some appearing as low domes pushed slightly upward, some as shallow pits sunk slightly downward, and some simply as dark rounded spots with no relief to them at all. They tend to be roughly similar to one another in size, and to occur in loose scattered groups rather than standing alone. Seen from above, they speckle the ice the way markings speckle an eggshell, small, soft blemishes on a bright surface. The 58th fact is that one particular feature deserves attention for the simple reason that craters on that moon are so very rare. Pool is a young impact crater about 24 kilometers across, sitting in the southern reaches of the moon with a dark shadowed floor and a modest central peak. What makes it truly unforgettable is not the bowl itself but everything lying scattered around it. Long, bright rays of fresh ice flung outward across the darker terrain, streaming for great distances in every direction. They reach so far that they cross other features entirely, laid over everything like pale light spilled from a single point, a white star painted on the ice. The 59th fact is that those bright rays tell us something about simple sequence, and it is a quietly satisfying piece of reasoning. Because the bright material from Pool lies on top of nearly everything it touches, and because such fresh ice would eventually be darkened and dulled by the constant radiation streaming past, the crater must be counted among the very youngest of all the features on a moon whose whole face is already remarkably young. It happened, in geological terms, only recently, on a surface that erases its own history so thoroughly. This bright scar has not yet had time to fade. The newest mark on a new face. The 60th fact is that the entire face of Europa is a map of its own slow motion. Every line, every paired ridge, every looping arc and reddish stain and jumbled patch of tilted blocks is the visible trace of something that shifted, opened, rose, settled, and then froze again. Nothing there was carved by wind or rain, and nothing at all was piled up by fire. It was all made by a slow, patient, endless flexing of a shell over water. To look at that moon is to look at motion made still, a record of restlessness in the calmest possible form. A world quietly remembering itself. The 61st fact is that beneath the bright, frozen face of Europa, there is almost certainly a global ocean of liquid salt water, wrapped completely around the little world like a hidden layer inside a seed. It is not a lake and not a sea in one region only, but one single body of water that touches every part of the moon at once, going all the way around beneath the ice without ever once being interrupted. Nothing on the surface announces it. There is no shimmer, no reflection, no open water anywhere to be seen. And still it is there, patient and dark, turning slowly with the moon, quietly holding its place. The 62nd fact is that nobody guessed at that ocean by looking downward, because no one could look downward at all. The idea arose instead from the strange youthfulness of the surface itself, from the way Europa's face looks freshly made compared with almost every other world we have photographed. Old surfaces in the solar system are crowded with craters, layered scar upon scar. But Europa's is remarkably smooth and clean, scored only by long curving cracks and gentle ridges. Something has been erasing the record, resurfacing the moon again and again over time. And the simplest explanation for a face that keeps renewing itself is soft material underneath, something able to flow. The 63rd fact is that a suspicion is not the same as proof, and for a long while the ocean remained an elegant idea rather than a measured fact. The decisive evidence arrived quietly, carried home by an instrument aboard the Galileo spacecraft, which orbited Jupiter from 1995 to 2003. Among the tools it carried was a magnetometer, a device that does nothing more dramatic than sense the direction and strength of magnetic fields as it drifts through them. It took no photographs of the sea, and it needed none. It simply passed close by, again and again, listening to something invisible, and the numbers told the story. The 64th fact is that Jupiter carries an enormous magnetic field, and that field is tilted, leaning away from the planet's axis of rotation rather than lining up neatly with it. Because of that tilt, as Jupiter turns, the field does not sit still around Europa. It sweeps past the moon, rising and falling and changing direction in a slow, steady rhythm, washing over the little world like a tide made of magnetism. And when that changing field arrives, something inside Europa answers it. The moon does not simply sit there quietly and absorb it. Something within responds with a faint magnetic voice of its own, a soft and steady reply. The 65th fact is that a reply of that kind is not something just any material can produce. To generate an induced magnetic field, a body needs a layer inside it that conducts electricity, a shell of something through which currents can freely circulate when an outside field changes around it. Solid rock will not do it. Ordinary cold ice will not do it either, for pure water ice is a poor conductor and simply lets the field pass through. But salty liquid water conducts beautifully, carrying currents through its dissolved minerals with ease. And so the answer coming back from Europa pointed toward a briny sea, hidden somewhere below. The 66th fact is that one of the loveliest details in the whole investigation is the way the induced field refuses to stay fixed. It wobbles, changing its orientation in perfect step with Jupiter's rotation, keeping time with the giant planet as faithfully as a shadow keeps time with the sun. That synchrony is what makes the case so convincing, and so hard to explain any other way. A permanent magnet frozen into the rock would hold one steady direction and never sway. Only a conducting layer, responding freshly to each new sweep of the outside field, would follow along so obediently. Europa keeps that beat without missing a turn, measure after measure, lap after lap. The 67th fact is that between us and that water lies the crust of ice, and the best current thinking places its thickness somewhere between 15 and 25 kilometers. That is a considerable lid, far deeper than any glacier on our own planet, far deeper than any ice sheet a person could imagine walking across. Standing on the surface, you would have beneath your boots more frozen water than the tallest mountains on Earth rise into the air. It is not a thin skin, and it is not a fragile one. It is a floor of ice, cold beyond ordinary cold, holding steady over the sea below, firm and pale and silent. The 68th fact is that a long and gentle disagreement runs among the people who study this moon, sometimes described as the thick ice camp and the thin ice camp. Each reads the same photographs and arrives at a slightly different picture of how far down the frozen ceiling reaches. A thicker shell would mean the ocean is well sealed, exchanging little with the surface, its waters kept apart from the sunlight above. A thinner shell would mean cracks might reach much closer to the sea, allowing material to travel between the two. Both possibilities remain in play, both carefully argued, both patiently awaiting better measurements. A question still resting open. The 69th fact is that the sheer depth of the water, once the ice has been crossed, is hard to hold in mind. The ocean below is thought to be somewhere between 60 and 150 kilometers deep, a range wide enough to allow for uncertainty and still astonishing at either end. Even the shallower figure would dwarf anything our own planet has managed. It is not a coastal shelf or a modest basin, but a body of water measured in the same units we normally reserve for mountain ranges and for the widths of continents. Beneath a small frozen moon, a sea of that scale simply waits, deep beyond easy imagining. The 70th fact is that the scale becomes a little easier to feel with a comparison. On Earth, the deepest place in any ocean is a narrow trench in the Pacific, a slender crack in the seafloor that has taken remarkable machines and remarkable patience to reach even once or twice. If you were to lower that entire trench into Europa's ocean, it would vanish. It would not touch bottom, would not come close, would simply hang somewhere in the upper part of that water with far more sea continuing beneath it. Our own deepest place would be only a shallow detail there, a small feature somewhere near the ceiling, swallowed without a ripple. The 71st fact is that the most striking number in the whole account belongs to the water itself. Europa's hidden ocean is believed to hold 2 to 3 times as much liquid water as every ocean on our own planet combined. All the Pacific and Atlantic and Indian and Southern and Arctic waters added together and then doubled. Every sea we have ever sailed, every wave that has ever reached a beach, every current that has ever carried warmth around our world, all of that gathered into one measure, and Europa still carries more. The water of an entire planet, and then a good deal more, tucked out of sight, beneath one quiet crust of ice. The 72nd fact is that the comparison grows stranger still because Europa is small. Its diameter is 3,122 kilometers, which makes it a little smaller than our own moon at 3,475, and the smallest of the 4 Galilean moons that Galileo Galilei found in January of 1610, a world you could think of as slightly less than our familiar moon. A body that would look modest hanging in an evening sky carries more liquid water than the whole of Earth. It is the kind of contrast that has to be repeated before it settles. Smallness and abundance held together in one place, quietly out of proportion. The 73rd fact is that the shape of that ocean is best pictured by what it lacks. It is global in the fullest sense, with no continents rising through it, no islands scattered across it, no shoreline anywhere at all. There is no place where water meets land and stops. There is no beach, no headland, no estuary where a river arrives. The sea simply continues in every direction, curving with the moon, meeting itself again on the far side without ever having been divided. It is unbroken in a way no ocean on our own world has ever been, uninterrupted from any starting point back to that same starting point, whole and without edges. The 74th fact is that there is no sky above that water either. On Earth, every sea has an open surface, a place where waves lift into air and light comes down and weather touches the water from above. Europa's ocean has no such boundary. Where our seas have air, that one has a ceiling of ice, a solid roof reaching upward for kilometers, cold and continuous across the entire moon. Nothing rises out of the water into open space. No spray, no cloud, no horizon. Only water and then the smooth underside of the ice pressing quietly back down against it. A roof of ice instead of a sky. The 75th fact is that there is no sunlight down there at all. Even at the surface, out at Jupiter's distance, the sun is faint, and beneath 15 to 25 kilometers of ice, not one photon of it survives the crossing. That darkness is not the dimness of a cloudy evening or the shade of deep water on Earth, where a little blue light still filters down. It is absolute and permanent, a darkness that has not been broken since the ocean formed. Whatever moves there moves unseen, by itself and to itself, with nothing to cast a shadow and nothing to catch a gleam, entirely and gently dark. The 76th fact is that the weight of all that water is considerable. At the bottom of such a sea, with kilometers of ocean and kilometers of ice stacked overhead, the pressure would be immense, greater than anything a diver could ever meet in our own oceans. Europa's gravity is modest, far weaker than Earth's, which softens the total somewhat. Yet the sheer height of the column more than makes up for it. Nothing about that weight ever eases, even for a moment. Down at the floor, water would be pressed against rock with a steadiness beyond anything familiar, held there without pause or variation, and the same in every single direction. Calm, heavy, and unchanging. The 77th fact is that the shell of ice above is not bolted to the rocky interior. Ice floats on water here, and it floats there as well, which means the entire crust may rest on the ocean rather than on stone. A floating shell can move. It can slide, drift slowly, rotate a little faster or slower than the interior beneath it, shifting position over long stretches of time. Nothing anchors it, and nothing holds it in one fixed position. Some of the great curving cracks across Europa's face appear to fit that idea, as though the whole frozen surface had been carried gently around, turning at its own pace. The 78th fact is that the ocean may not be the only water there. Within the ice shell itself, researchers suspect there could be pockets and lenses and shallow lakes, bodies of liquid trapped inside the frozen layer well above the main sea. Warm ice rising slowly through colder ice could melt small reservoirs along the way, which would then sit in place, sealed on all sides. They would be small beside the ocean and far closer to the surface. Each one would be closed off entirely from the great sea below. Some of the jumbled terrain above looks very much like ground that collapsed over such a pocket. Quiet waters held and enclosed. The 79th fact is that the sea may have been liquid for a very long stretch of time. If the heating that keeps it warm has been running steadily, then the ocean could have stayed unfrozen for very nearly the entire age of the solar system, billions of years without a pause. That is a duration hard to hold in the mind. No shoreline we know of is anywhere near as old. It means the water was already there and already dark when our own continents were unformed, and it has gone on being there, undisturbed, through every event our planet has known. It has kept no record of any of it and needed none, simply continuing. The 80th fact is that all of this rests on inference rather than on sight. No one has ever seen that ocean, not once and not even in outline. No eye, no lens, no instrument has ever met its surface or sounded its depth. And every single thing we believe about it has been inferred from the outside. We know it the way you might know there is water in a sealed vessel by the way it answers when the vessel is moved. Somewhere out there, right now, an enormous sea is turning slowly in perfect darkness, unwitnessed and undisturbed, going about its long and patient business without hurry, asking nothing of anyone at all. The 81st fact is that the question of why that water stays liquid at all has a surprising answer. Out at Jupiter's distance, the sun is no longer a warm disk in the sky, but only a small brilliant point, the brightest star in view and little more than that. Sunlight arriving there is spread thin, weakened by the long crossing, far too faint to melt anything or to keep anything melted. Noon there would look very much like a clear night here. You could stand on Europa's ice at noon and feel nothing at all of that light. The sun is present and lovely and almost entirely powerless. A bright and distant spark. The 82nd fact is that by every simple expectation, Europa ought to be frozen straight through. The surface sits at about 160 degrees below 0 Celsius near the equator, and near about 220 degrees below zero at the poles, temperatures at which water ice behaves almost like rock. A small body that far from any star should have given up its internal warmth long ago and settled into a single cold solid all the way to its center. That is what the arithmetic of size and distance predicts. And yet the moon carries a living ocean inside it. Something in the sum is missing. The 83rd fact is that the missing term has nothing to do with sunlight. The heat comes instead from tides, from the constant mechanical working of the moon by the gravity of the giant planet it circles. This is warmth generated by motion rather than by light, made inside the body itself as it is bent and released. It needs no star nearby and no atmosphere to trap it. It is warmth that comes from being pulled at over and over, rather than from any light at all. Nothing outside the system has to supply it. It arises simply from being close to something enormous and moving in a particular way, heat born of movement alone. The 84th fact is that the mechanism behind it is simple enough to picture. Jupiter is vast, and its gravity does not pull equally on every part of a nearby moon, tugging noticeably harder on the near side than on the far side simply because the near side is closer. That difference is small in absolute terms and relentless in practice. The near side is drawn slightly ahead, the far side lags slightly behind, and the whole moon is gently pulled along its length. The same effect raises tides in our own seas, only here it acts on solid ice and rock as well as water, and never once lets go. One steady stretching hand. The 85th fact is that this difference actually changes the shape of the moon. Europa is not perfectly round but is drawn slightly out of round, stretched a little along the line pointing toward Jupiter, so that it carries a gentle bulge at either end. The moon keeps the same face toward the planet as it goes in synchronous rotation, its orbit of 3.5 days at about 671,000 kilometers matching its turn exactly. Europa is warmed from within by the simple act of orbiting. So the bulge stays roughly in place, pointing where it has always pointed, softly and permanently deformed. The 86th fact is that the orbit is not a perfect circle, and this is the detail that makes everything else possible. Europa's path is slightly oval, so the moon comes a little nearer to Jupiter at one point in its lap and draws a little farther away at another. Because the distance changes, the strength of the pull changes with it, rising as the moon comes in and easing as it swings out. The difference from a perfect circle is small, and it is quite real. Nothing about it is sudden, and nothing about it stops. The stretching is therefore not steady but rhythmic, growing and relaxing with every circuit, a slow and regular breathing. The 87th fact is that the rhythm has a direct consequence. With every lap the moon is squeezed and then released, the bulge growing a little taller and then settling, the whole body flexing gently in and out of shape. It is worked the way dough is worked under patient hands, kneaded again and again without hurry and without end. Nothing about any single flexing is dramatic. The change in shape is modest, and if you were standing there you would never feel it happening. The value of the process lies entirely in its repetition. But it never stops, and it has never stopped, lap after lap for billions of years, endlessly and softly kneaded. The 88th fact is that kneading produces heat, as anyone who has bent a piece of wire back and forth in their hands has quietly discovered. Inside Europa, layers of ice and rock slide microscopically against one another as the moon changes shape, and that internal friction turns motion into warmth. The energy of the orbit is slowly converted into heat spread through the interior. Friction is doing all of the quiet work. It arrives gradually, and it never arrives all at once. It is not fierce heat, not enough to make the moon glow, but it is constant enough to keep an enormous quantity of water from freezing, warmth made by gentle rubbing. The 89th fact is that the mirror of all this shows how delicate the arrangement is. If Europa's orbit were a perfect circle, the distance to Jupiter would never change, the pull would never rise or fall, and the bulge would simply hold one fixed shape forever. With no flexing there would be no friction, and with no friction there would be no heat. The chain is short, and each link in it matters. The interior would slowly give up whatever warmth remained, and the ocean would thicken and freeze from the top down over long ages. A perfectly tidy orbit would have been the quiet end of that sea. A small imperfection quietly essential. The 90th fact is that something keeps the orbit from ever rounding out. Left alone, tides would gradually pull an orbit toward a circle, smoothing the ovalness away over time, and the heating would fade. What prevents that is not anything inside Europa at all, but the company it keeps. The answer lies out in the orbits of other worlds entirely. The moon is locked into an orbital resonance with two of its neighbors, Io on the inside and Ganymede on the outside, and their combined influence keeps tugging its path back into a gentle oval. Without them, it would have rounded itself out long ago. Neighbors quietly holding it open. The 91st fact is that the arrangement has a precise name. It is a 1 to 2 to 4 resonance, which means that for every single circuit Ganymede completes around Jupiter, Europa completes 2, and Io completes 4. The three orbital periods stand in exact small whole number ratios with one another, which is a remarkably tidy thing for nature to arrange and to keep. Nothing forces them into it by design. The ratios simply held once they had been found. They settled into that rhythm long ago through the slow give and take of gravity between them, and they have held it ever since, counting out their laps together in order 4 and 2 and 1. The 92nd fact is that those simple ratios matter enormously, and for a clear reason. Because the periods line up so neatly, the moons return to the same relative positions again and again, meeting up at the same points in their orbits rather than at scattered places. Each time they pass, they tug on one another, and because the tug always comes at the same place in the lap, the effects do not cancel out. They add, patiently, one small pull upon another, the way a swing rises higher when it is pushed in time. Nothing is wasted because nothing arrives at the wrong moment. A nudge always given on the beat. The 93rd fact is that the mathematics behind this lock was worked out long before anyone knew there was an ocean, or could have imagined one. Pierre-Simon Laplace studied the motions of Jupiter's inner moons and showed that their periods were bound together in a stable relationship. He demonstrated that the arrangement was not a coincidence to be admired but a genuine equilibrium, able to correct itself and to persist. He could not have known what it was keeping warm. The result stands today exactly as he left it. A piece of pure celestial mechanics turned out to be the reason a distant sea has never frozen. An old proof quietly at work. The 94th fact is that the resonance behaves like a celestial metronome, keeping a beat that has not faltered for an extraordinarily long time. Three worlds, each enormous in its own right, moving in a locked rhythm that repeats and repeats without ever drifting out of step. A metronome in a quiet room keeps time for as long as someone wins it. This one was never wound by anybody. This one has been keeping time for billions of years with nothing winding it at all, sustained only by the geometry of its own arrangement. There is no mechanism to wear out and no spring to run down. Steady and utterly reliable. The 95th fact is that the same process reaches all three moons, though not equally, and Io shows what happens at the extreme. Being closest to Jupiter, Io feels the strongest tidal working of all, flexed harder and faster than either of its outer companions. The result is the most volcanic world in the solar system, a place where the interior is heated so thoroughly that molten material reaches the surface constantly and the whole face is remade again and again. It is the same recipe as Europa's, only turned up a long way. It shows plainly how much the very same gentle mechanism is able to do, warmth carried to its limit. The 96th fact is that Europa sits in the middle of that arrangement and receives a milder share. Farther out than Io, it is flexed less strongly, warmed less fiercely, heated just enough rather than heated to excess. Too much and its water would boil away or its interior would churn like Io's. Too little and the ocean would have frozen long ago into a single solid ball. The moon happens to sit between those two outcomes. The balance was not arranged for anyone, and it holds all the same. Instead, the moon receives a modest, well-tempered warmth, enough to hold an enormous sea in liquid form, the gentle middle of three. The 97th fact is that Ganymede, farthest out of the three, feels the mildest working of all. Its share of the tidal rhythm is the smallest, and its interior is correspondingly quieter than either of its inner companions. It is thought to hold water of its own, deeper down and differently arranged, but the vigorous kneading that shapes Io and warms Europa reaches it only faintly. It is the calmest of the three, and the least changed by the whole arrangement. Together the three form a graceful sequence, from fierce to moderate to mild, laid out in order of distance like notes descending a scale. The same idea, growing softer outward. The 98th fact is that all of this shows itself at the surface as well. As Europa moves along its slightly oval path, the ice itself rises and falls, lifting by a modest amount and settling again with each circuit around Jupiter. It is a tide, but a tide made of solid ground rather than water, the whole frozen shell breathing slowly up and down over 3.5 days. The rise is gentle and the fall is gentler still. Anyone standing there would notice nothing at all, for the motion is far too slow and too gentle to feel. The land itself swells and eases beneath the stars. A tide of ice, unhurried. The 99th fact is that this changed our thinking thoroughly. For a long time it was assumed that liquid water required a nearby star, that a world had to sit within a narrow warm band around its sun to keep an ocean of any kind. Europa quietly set that assumption aside. The rule was simply not as strict as it once looked. Here is water kept liquid not by starlight at all but by gravity and geometry, by the pull of a giant planet and the timing of neighboring moons. The warm band around a star is no longer the only place worth looking. Oceans may hide far out in the cold, in the dark and still liquid. The 100th fact is that the arrangement is a quiet one. 3 moons circling a planet they will never touch, keeping a rhythm no one arranged and no one maintains, counting out their laps in the ratio of 1 and 2 and 4. From that patient time-keeping comes a small warmth, and from that warmth comes an ocean larger than all of ours, dark and unbroken and undisturbed beneath its ceiling of ice. Nothing there knows it is happening. No one keeps the rhythm and no one checks it. There is no purpose in it anywhere, and no effort in it either. The water simply goes on being water, kept awake by their quiet company. The 101st fact is that among all the icy moons we know, Europa may hold something quietly unusual, an ocean that rests directly upon stone. Beneath that shell of ice, between 15 and 25 kilometers thick, the water is thought to reach downward until it simply meets rock, with nothing in between. No separating layer, no barrier, only the ancient floor of a world touching the sea that covers it. That single arrangement, so simple to describe, is one of the most interesting things about this moon. It changes what the water can become and what it can gather over the long, unhurried patience of time. A sea with a stone floor. The 102nd fact is that the larger icy moons are built differently, and the difference matters more than it might sound. On Ganymede and on Callisto, the oceans are far deeper, and the weight of all that water presses down with such steady force that, at the bottom, the water freezes again into a strange dense ice, an ice that forms not from cold but from pressure alone. A floor of ice beneath a sea of water. So on those worlds, the ocean never touches rock at all. It rests on a smooth, pale layer that keeps the stone forever out of reach, sealed away below, quietly separated and quietly still. The 103rd fact is that when water and rock touch each other directly, chemistry begins, slowly and without any drama. Minerals in the stone dissolve into the water, a little at a time, and the water carries away salts and elements that were locked in the rock since the world was young. A gentle, endless exchange along the seam where the two meet. This is not a violent process. It is closer to the way a river slowly sweetens with the minerals of the hills it passes through. On Europa, that same patient trade may have been going on beneath the ice for an unimaginably long while, quietly enriching the dark. The 104th fact is that Europa's interior is probably not cold and finished, but still warm in its own quiet way. The same tidal kneading that keeps the ocean from freezing does not stop at the ice. It reaches down into the rocky body beneath the water, flexing it gently as the moon travels its path around Jupiter. A slow squeezing that turns motion into warmth. That warmth would not be fierce. It would be the low, persistent heat of something being worked over and over without rest. And a warm, rocky floor beneath a cold ocean is exactly the kind of place where interesting things can happen, softly, without any hurry. The 105th fact is that where a warm, rocky floor meets a cold ocean, hot springs can form. Water seeps down into cracks in the stone, is heated in the depths, and rises again carrying whatever it has dissolved along the way. A slow circulation, breathing minerals up into the sea. On Earth we call these hydrothermal vents, and they are common wherever the crust is young and warm beneath the water. There is no way yet to know whether Europa's seafloor has them, but the ingredients seem to be present, the rock, the heat, and the water pressed against it. A reasonable and gentle guess. The 106th fact is that we did not always know such places existed, even on our own planet. It was only when small crude submersibles began descending into the deepest trenches, in the 1970s, that anyone saw them with their own eyes, lights sweeping across a seafloor no one had ever visited. The people inside those little spheres expected barren mud and cold silence. What they found instead was warm water shimmering up from the rock, and the water was crowded with life. It was one of those rare moments when a single dive quietly rearranged an entire field of science. A surprise waiting in the dark. The 107th fact is that some of those vents build chimneys, tall and dark and strangely delicate. Superheated water rises from the crust carrying dissolved minerals, and when it meets the freezing water of the deep sea, those minerals fall out of solution instantly and settle into stone. A chimney growing from its own smoke. The plumes look black, which is how they came to be called black smokers, though nothing is burning. The color is only fine particles of metal and sulfide, drifting upward in the dark. They stand there in the cold, building themselves patiently, one thin layer at a time, towers made of chilled water. The 108th fact is that these chimneys are surrounded by whole gatherings of living things, in a place with no light whatsoever. Long tube worms sway in the warm current, some of them taller than a person, capped in soft red. Pale crabs move across the rock with unhurried steps, and shrimp cluster so thickly in places that the stone seems to shimmer. An entire neighborhood in permanent night. Nothing there has ever seen the sun, and nothing there needs to. The whole community is arranged around the warm mineral water rising from below, as though gathered close to a hearth on the seafloor. Quiet company in the deep. The 109th fact is that these creatures live on chemistry rather than on sunlight, and this is the part that changed everything. Tiny microbes take the chemicals dissolved in the vent water, sulfides and hydrogen and others, and draw energy directly from the reactions between them. A kind of eating that needs no sky at all. This is called chemosynthesis, and everything else at the vent depends upon it, the worms and the crabs and the shrimp, all of them resting on that invisible foundation. Life, it turns out, does not strictly require a star overhead. It requires only a gradient and something to work upon, energy in another form. The 110th fact is that this discovery quietly rewrote what scientists were willing to call a habitable place. Before it, the search for life beyond Earth followed sunlight, looking for worlds at just the right distance from their star, warm enough for lakes and rain. A narrow ribbon of possibility around each sun. Afterward, the map grew much larger. If life can live on chemistry in perpetual darkness, then it does not need to sit near a star at all. It could rest under kilometers of ice, in a sea no light has ever reached, far out where the sun is only another bright point. A wider definition of home. The 111th fact is that the same arrangement may exist on Europa's floor tonight, while you are lying here. Warm water seeping through cracks in the rock, rising through the cold dark, carrying minerals upward into a sea that has never known a shore. The same physics, a very long way from home. Nobody knows whether anything lives there, and no one is claiming that anything does. But the setting seems to be present, and the setting has been present most likely for a very long time. That thought is not frightening. It is simply strange and quiet and rather beautiful, a possibility drifting far away. The 112th fact is that we already know Europa's ocean is salty, because the salt shows itself on the surface. Spectra taken of the reddish-brown material along the cracks reveal salts of the kind that would form if seawater rich in dissolved minerals had reached the top and dried there. An ocean leaving faint traces on the lid that covers it. Among them, and pleasingly ordinary, is sodium chloride, the same common table salt that sits on kitchen tables everywhere. It is a small, homely detail in the middle of something enormous, and somehow it makes the whole distant world feel a little more familiar. Salt from another sea. The 113th fact is that the way this salt was recognized is a lovely piece of laboratory patience. Pure sodium chloride is white and would look unremarkable from far away, but under the constant radiation that sweeps across Europa's surface, its crystals develop tiny defects that absorb light and turn it a pale yellow. White salt, quietly changing color. Researchers reproduced those conditions in a chamber on Earth, irradiating salt until it took on that same tint, and then compared it with the color seen on the moon. The match was close enough to be persuasive, and the ocean's chemistry came a little more clearly into view, found by imitation. The 114th fact is that the radiation streaming over Europa is not only destructive, it is also creative in a strange way. When charged particles strike the ice, they break apart the water molecules there, splitting them into their pieces, and among the pieces is oxygen, radiation quietly making breathable air on the surface of a frozen moon. Some of it escapes into space, and some of it becomes bound up in the ice itself, held in the frozen surface like a stored breath. It is a curious thought that the same particle storm which sterilizes the surface may also be manufacturing something valuable there. A gift left on the lid. The 115th fact is that oxygen made at the top does no good at the top, unless something carries it down. But Europa's shell is not a static plate. There is evidence that regions of the ice overturn, that warmer material rises and older surface sinks, and that the whole crust slowly recycles itself over long spans of time. A lid that stirs very gently. If that is so, then oxidants made at the surface could be folded downward, delivered eventually into the ocean below. That would give the sea something it could not make for itself, arriving slowly from above, over ages, a delivery from the sky. The 116th fact is that the James Webb Space Telescope, looking at Europa with its infrared eyes, found carbon dioxide on the surface, concentrated in the chaotic terrain where the ice appears most disturbed. The location matters more than the substance. Carbon dioxide does not survive long under Europa's radiation, so what we see must be relatively fresh. A young stain on an old face. Its concentration in the broken terrain hints that it welled up from inside, from the ocean itself, rather than arriving on some comet from outside. If that reading holds, then the sea below contains carbon, and carbon is the element that life is built from. A promising trace. The 117th fact is that when scientists ask whether a place could support life, they usually count three things. First, liquid water, a place for chemistry to happen. Second, the right chemical ingredients, carbon and nitrogen, and the rest dissolved and available. Third, a source of energy, some gradient that can be tapped. Three simple requirements, repeated softly in every discussion. Europa appears to have a great deal of water, hints of carbon reaching the surface from within, and a warm rocky floor that could supply energy through chemistry rather than light. All three boxes on the evidence we have seem quietly to be marked rare for a world so far away. The 118th fact is that having the ingredients is not at all the same as having life, and scientists say this carefully and often. A kitchen stocked with flour and water and warmth is not bread. Somewhere between the ingredients and the living thing there is a step we do not understand, not even on our own planet where it certainly happened. The one transition still missing from the story. So Europa is described as habitable rather than inhabited, and the distinction is honored strictly. It is a place where life could exist, which is a much smaller claim than saying it does. A careful, honest word. The 119th fact is that whatever chemistry that ocean holds, it has almost certainly not stayed the same. Across billions of years, the rock below would have given up its minerals gradually. The tides would have risen and eased as orbits shifted, and the trickle of oxidants from above would have come and gone with the changing shell. A sea slowly altering its own recipe. An ocean is not a fixed thing but a long conversation between water and stone and time. Whatever we eventually find there will be a snapshot of one moment in a very long story, most of which we will never read. A chapter, not a book. The 120th fact is that no one has ever seen the floor of that ocean. Not once. Not in any form. We have photographed the cracked surface from orbit and measured the magnetic whisper of the salty water beneath, but the seafloor itself, the actual rock where the water meets the stone, lies beyond every instrument we have ever sent. A landscape with no portrait. It has been there, in complete and unbroken darkness, since long before anything at all walked upon the earth. Whatever shapes it holds, whatever slow shimmer rises from its cracks, they have never been witnessed by anything at all, waiting without impatience. The 121st fact is that Europa may not keep its ocean entirely to itself. There are indications, faint and much debated, that this moon occasionally releases water into space, sending thin fountains of vapor up through the ice and out above the surface, a quiet exhalation from a sealed world. Such plumes would not roar or tower dramatically. They would be tenuous, ghostly things, barely visible even to instruments designed to find them. But if they are real, then some of the ocean or something connected to it is being lifted out where we could reach it without ever drilling a hole. An ocean offering a sample. The 122nd fact is that we only knew to look because of a smaller moon far away at Saturn. Enceladus, bright and modest in size, was found to be spraying water vapor and ice grains continuously from cracks near its south pole, and a spacecraft flew straight through the spray and analyzed it. A little world caught in the act. That discovery taught planetary scientists a new habit of attention. If one icy moon could vent its hidden sea into space, others might do the same, and Europa, larger and closer to home, became an obvious place to point the telescopes. A lesson learned from a neighbor. The 123rd fact is that much of the searching was done by the Hubble Space Telescope, working in ultraviolet light rather than the light our eyes use. Water vapor, when struck by the charged particles around Jupiter, glows faintly at particular ultraviolet wavelengths, and that glow can be mapped even when the vapor itself is far too thin to see. A whisper of light standing in for the water. In several separate observations spread across a number of years, Hubble recorded a faint patch of such emission near Europa's southern polar regions, in roughly the shape one might expect from a plume rising and falling back. A smudge of light quietly suggestive. The 124th fact is that there is a second and rather elegant method, which uses Jupiter itself as a lamp. When Europa passes in front of the bright disk of the planet, anything above the moon's surface will absorb a little of that light on its way to us, casting the faintest shadow of vapor against the glow behind. A silhouette measured rather than seen. Astronomers watched several of these crossings with great care, looking for the slightest dimming at the edge of the moon's limb, exactly where a plume might be standing. In one or two cases they found something, small and uncertain but present, a shadow made of mist. The 125th fact is that these detections sit right at the edge of what the instruments can honestly do, and everyone involved knows it. The signals are only slightly stronger than the noise, they do not appear every time anyone looks, and different teams analyzing the same data have sometimes reached different conclusions. An answer that keeps flickering just out of focus. That is not a failure. It is what the frontier actually looks like when you stand on it. Real discoveries often arrive this way first, as something faint and arguable, long before they become something everyone agrees upon. A hint, not yet a fact. The 126th fact is that one of the strongest clues came not from a new telescope but from an old archive. Years after the Galileo spacecraft finished its long tour of Jupiter, having orbited the planet from 1995 to 2003, a researcher went back through its stored measurements from one particularly close pass over Europa. Old numbers opened again with new questions. In that record, there was a strange bend in the magnetic field and an unexpected surge in the plasma around the spacecraft, exactly where a plume of water would have produced one. The craft may have flown through it without anyone noticing. An encounter discovered afterward. The 127th fact is that there is something deeply satisfying about an answer that waited patiently in a filing cabinet for decades. The spacecraft that gathered those readings had long since been sent into Jupiter's atmosphere. Its mission complete, its fuel spent, its instruments silent forever. But its numbers remained, carefully stored, asking nothing. A message left behind, unopened. When new ideas made it worth looking again, the data were still there and still good, and they gave up something no one had thought to ask them for. It is one of the quiet reasons science keeps everything it records, even when nobody yet knows why. Patience rewarded slowly. The 128th fact is that whatever these plumes are, they do not seem to be permanent. Observations that find a signal are followed months later by observations that find nothing at all from the same instruments, looking at the same moon in very much the same way, with the same care. something that comes and goes. This intermittence is a large part of the reason the whole subject remains unsettled, because a feature that vanishes is very hard to confirm. But it may also be telling us something true about the moon, that the venting is occasional rather than constant, opening and closing as conditions change. A world that breathes irregularly. The 129th fact is that if the plumes do come and go, the tides are the natural suspect. Europa completes its circuit around Jupiter in about 3.5 days, and because of the orbital resonance of 1 to 2 to 4 that it shares with Io and Ganymede, its path stays slightly stretched rather than perfectly circular. A rhythm that never quite settles. That means the flexing of the shell rises and falls on a regular schedule, and cracks that are squeezed shut at one point in the orbit could be pulled gently open at another. Vents that follow such a beat would appear and disappear on time. A tide with a keyhole. The 130th fact is that water reaching the surface of Europa would not behave the way water does here. With almost no atmosphere and temperatures far below anything on Earth, it would not flow or pool. It would flash into vapor and then freeze in an instant, becoming a cloud of fine ice crystals almost as soon as it emerged. A fountain turning into snow in midair. Most of those crystals would arc upward, slow, and drift back down to settle softly on the surrounding ice. The plume would essentially fall as a gentle snowfall onto a plain that has never felt rain. Snow returning quietly home. The 131st fact is that the water in a plume might not come from the deep ocean at all. Radar and modeling suggest that the ice shell itself may hold pockets of liquid, lakes trapped within the crust, some of them possibly quite large, held between layers of ice far above the true seafloor. Hidden water nearer the top than we imagine. If a crack opens into one of those shallow lakes rather than into the main sea, the material that escapes would tell us about the shell rather than about the ocean. That would be less thrilling but still worth knowing. A different water still interesting. The 132nd fact is that plumes matter enormously for a very practical reason, which is that they save us from having to dig. Drilling through 15 to 25 kilometers of ice with a machine sent across the solar system is, for now, well beyond anything we can build and deliver. A wall we cannot yet get through. But if the moon is lifting its own water above the surface, even occasionally, then a spacecraft passing overhead could gather that material directly, without ever touching down. The ocean would come up to meet the visitor, which is an unreasonably convenient arrangement, and a rare piece of luck. The sea handing up a sample. The 133rd fact is that flying a spacecraft directly through a plume is not a fantasy. It has already been done elsewhere. The Cassini mission passed repeatedly through the spray of Enceladus, at considerable speed, sampling the grains and vapor as it went and surviving every pass unharmed. A rehearsal performed years in advance. Europa Clipper, which launched on the 14th of October of 2024 and arrives in April of 2030, carries instruments capable of doing something similar if the opportunity presents itself. The plan is simply to be ready for it and then to watch and to wait patiently, prepared just in case. The 134th fact is that the tasting would be done by two particular kinds of instrument. A mass spectrometer takes whatever gas enters it, breaks the molecules into charged fragments, and sorts them by weight, producing a list of what was there. A scale so fine it can weigh a single molecule. Alongside it, a dust analyzer catches solid grains as they strike a target at high speed and reads the flash of their impact to learn their composition. Between the two, a spacecraft flying through a faint mist can come away with a fairly detailed account of an unseen ocean, a chemistry set in flight. The 135th fact is that what those instruments would be looking for is fairly specific. Salts first, to confirm what kind of sea lies below and how thoroughly the water has been in contact with rock. Then organic molecules, the carbon-bearing compounds that make up the working parts of every living thing we know. Not life itself, but the vocabulary life is written in. Amino acids, should any of them turn up, would be genuinely remarkable. Even simpler carbon chains would matter. None of it would prove anything alive, but each finding would tell us how far along the chemistry of that hidden ocean has traveled. A reading of the ingredients. The 136th fact is that the caution the scientists keep around all of this is worth admiring. Every paper on Europa's plumes is threaded with careful qualifications, with the words possible and consistent with and cannot yet be ruled out. A discipline of not saying more than you know. It would be very easy and enormously popular to announce a great deal more than the evidence actually supports. Instead, the community keeps stating plainly that the detections are marginal, that alternative explanations exist, and that confirmation has not arrived. That restraint is not timidity at all. It is precisely the thing that will make the eventual answer worth trusting. Honesty, practiced deliberately. The 137th fact is that science is unusually comfortable living alongside an open question, for years or even for generations. The matter of Europa's plumes has stood unresolved for more than a decade now, and in that time nobody has needed to force it closed. A question, allowed simply to remain a question. Observations accumulate slowly, models improve, instruments are designed and built and launched, and the answer is approached gradually rather than seized. There is a kind of calm in that, a willingness to not know for a while, which is perhaps the least celebrated and the most quietly useful habit the whole enterprise has ever developed. Waiting without anxiety. The 138th fact is that we will likely know much more before this decade is finished. A spacecraft is already on its way, moving quietly through the dark between the planets, carrying cameras and spectrometers and radar built specifically for these questions. A machine sent to settle an argument patiently. When it finally arrives, it will make dozens of close passes over the moon, watching the surface carefully and sampling whatever thin material surrounds it, again and again. Answers that have hovered just out of reach for more than a decade may simply become ordinary knowledge, written down and no longer wondered about. A question gently resolved. The 139th fact is that even if the plumes turn out to be nothing, the search itself will have been worth the effort. Every single attempt taught someone how to measure something almost impossibly faint, how to separate a signal from noise, how to ask an old dataset a question it was never built to answer. Skills that outlast whatever prompted them. And if the plumes are real, then a moon far out in the cold has been handing us pieces of its hidden sea, freely and without being asked, for as long as anyone on this planet has been watching. A quiet generosity that nobody arranged. The 140th fact is that somewhere out there, right now, a small bright world is circling an enormous planet, and it may be very gently breathing into the dark. Thin veils of vapor rising from its cracks, freezing at once, drifting slowly back down as snow onto a surface older than any memory. An exhale, and then a long, quiet pause. Beneath it all lies a sea nobody has seen, resting on a floor nobody has touched, going about its slow chemistry in perfect darkness, entirely undisturbed by our curiosity. It has been doing this the whole time, and it will keep doing it while you sleep, softly and without end. The 141st fact is that Jupiter is wrapped in the largest magnetic field belonging to any planet in our solar system. An invisible cocoon so vast that if our eyes could see it, it would spread across our night sky far wider than the full moon. It is generated deep inside the planet, where hydrogen is squeezed so tightly that it begins to behave like a liquid metal, flowing and turning and carrying enormous electric currents along with it. That slow churning makes a field of tremendous strength and tremendous reach, stretching millions of kilometers outward, shaped and swept by the solar wind into a long, soft tail. An unseen kingdom around a giant. The 142nd fact is that inside that magnetic kingdom lie the radiation belts, great invisible sheets of charged particles caught in the curving field lines and racing around Jupiter at tremendous speed. Electrons and ions, stripped from volcanic gas and from the passing solar wind, spiral along those lines, bouncing from north to south and back again, drifting slowly around the planet in an endless circuit. They form wide donut-shaped zones of energy that no eye can see and no camera can photograph directly. Though radio telescopes here on Earth can hear their soft crackling hiss from across the solar system. A quiet storm that never rains. The 143rd fact is that Europa does not sit safely outside those belts but travels squarely within them, sweeping through that thin sea of particles on every single lap around its enormous planet. It cannot dodge them and it cannot outrun them, because the belts turn faster than the moon does. So the charged particles constantly overtake it from behind and wash across its icy surface. Every single orbit of the moon is a slow and silent crossing of an invisible river, and the moon simply carries on, patient and entirely unbothered, its bright shell quietly taking the weather of a giant, turning gently, again and again. The 144th fact is that the surface of Europa receives a radiation dose of roughly 5.4 sieverts each day, a figure that sounds gentle only because the units are so unfamiliar to most of us. In practical terms, it means the ice is bathed continuously in fast-moving particles, arriving from nearly every direction, day and night, with no pause and no shelter anywhere. There is no thick atmosphere overhead to absorb them and no strong magnetic shield of the moon's own to turn them aside. So the dose simply falls, as steady as weather, onto a landscape that has endured it for ages, calmly, and without complaint. The 145th fact is that a dose of that size lies far beyond what any unprotected human body could survive for long, and an astronaut standing bare upon that ice would receive in a single day rather more than a whole career of permitted exposure. It is one of the reasons that any future visit would need to happen inside thick shielding, or below the surface, or in very brief and carefully counted hours, and yet none of this touches you where you are lying. All of that radiation is bound to Jupiter's magnetic field, held there, unable ever to travel, utterly far from your quiet room. The 146th fact is that radiation of this kind is unkind to electronics in a very particular way, because a single fast particle passing through a microchip can flip a bit, corrupt a memory, or leave behind a tiny permanent scar in the silicon itself. Over time, those scars accumulate, transistors grow leaky, sensors gather false speckles of light, and instruments slowly lose their sharpness. Engineers describe it as a spacecraft aging quickly, living whole years of wear in a matter of weeks. Everything sent into that region must therefore be built to tolerate a punishment that no earthly machine ever faces, designed, quite simply, to endure. The 147th fact is that armoring against such an environment is not a matter of adding a thin sheet of foil but of building a genuine shelter, choosing dense materials, arranging components so that the most delicate of them hide behind the sturdiest, and testing everything in beams of particles here on Earth during the long months before the launch itself. Some parts are made deliberately old-fashioned, because simpler and older circuits, with larger features etched into their surfaces, tolerate stray particles far better than the newest and finest ones do. It is an unusual kind of engineering where robustness matters more than speed, strength chosen over cleverness. The 148th fact is that the Europa Clipper carries its most vital electronics inside a thick-walled metal vault, a heavy box whose dense walls surround the spacecraft's brain, rather as a helmet surrounds a skull. Inside that vault sit the computers, the memory, and the most sensitive control systems, all huddled quietly together in the safest volume aboard the entire craft. The metal absorbs a great share of the incoming particles, cutting the dose within to a level the machinery can survive across long years of repeated passes. It is a small dark room built for silence in a very loud place, a shelter carried across the void. The 149th fact is that the cold on Europa is profound and unbroken, reaching about 160 degrees below 0 Celsius even at the equator, where the distant sun climbs highest into the black sky. Sunlight out at that great distance is faint and thin, spread thin by the enormous distance, delivering only a small fraction of the warmth that falls upon our own world. Nothing lingers as heat, and the long day never truly warms anything at all. Noon on Europa is colder than the deepest winter ever recorded anywhere on Earth, colder than any place a person has ever stood. A stillness held in ice. The 150th fact is that toward the poles the temperature falls further still, sinking to something near 220 degrees below 0 Celsius, where the sun barely lifts above the horizon and the ice receives only a long slanting light. In those far northern and southern regions, the frost has lain quite undisturbed for ages upon ages, so cold that the molecules locked within it scarcely move at all. Chemistry there slows almost to a complete halt, and whatever settles tends to remain exactly as it landed, unchanged. They are among the most motionless places that we know of anywhere nearby, quiet beyond our ordinary imagining. The 151st fact is that water ice, when chilled to such extraordinary temperatures, stops behaving like the familiar slippery stuff we scrape from a windshield on a winter morning and becomes as hard and unyielding as granite. It rings rather than crunches underfoot, and it fractures rather than dents when it is struck, and it can hold cliffs and ridges upright for enormous spans of time without ever slumping. Engineers who think about landing there must treat the ground as rock instead of snow, and imagine drills rather than shovels. What we call ice on Europa is, in truth, a kind of pale stone, solid, patient, and very old. The 152nd fact is that there is essentially nothing at all to breathe on Europa, for the surface sits in what is effectively a vacuum, emptier than the finest chambers we can pump out in a laboratory here at home. No wind stirs there at all. No sound of any kind can carry, and a whisper would die away before it ever left the lips. Dust lifted by a small impact does not float and settle slowly but flies in clean unhurried arcs and lands exactly where physics says it must. Every footprint would sit in perfect stillness, unsmudged by any passing breeze. A world without a single sigh. The 153rd fact is that Europa nevertheless possesses an atmosphere of its very own, an astonishingly thin one made mostly of oxygen, so tenuous that it is measured not by pressure at all but by counting the individual molecules present above each small patch of frozen ground. It is a wisp, a faint suggestion, hardly more than the mere memory of an atmosphere, and yet it is genuinely there. It was first detected by telescopes patiently watching how ultraviolet light behaved in the space around the moon. Nature, given ice and energy and time, seems to produce a breath even where none was expected, faint but unmistakably real. The 154th fact is that this oxygen would be of no use whatsoever to a visitor, for it is so sparse that human lungs would find nothing in it at all, and bare skin would register no faintest touch of air upon it. Standing there, you would sense only the vacuum, and the thin oxygen would drift past unnoticed around you like a rumor. It exists in a chemical sense rather than a bodily one, a technicality that delights scientists and would comfort no traveler whatsoever. The word atmosphere here means something very different from the one wrapped around you now. Present, yet weightless as nothing. The 155th fact is that this delicate oxygen is manufactured continuously by the radiation itself. As fast particles strike the surface ice and break apart the water molecules locked away within it. Each broken molecule leaves behind hydrogen and oxygen, and the hydrogen, being extraordinarily light, drifts upward easily and escapes away into open space. The heavier oxygen atoms linger instead, staying near the surface, held a little longer by the moon's gentle gravity, slowly gathering itself into that faint, invisible veil above the ice. So the very thing that makes the surface hostile is also the thing that grants it an atmosphere, harm and gift tangled together. The 156th fact is that this same steady bombardment performs a process the scientists call sputtering, in which arriving particles knock atoms and molecules loose from the very uppermost layer of ice and send them flying off the surface entirely and out into space. Grain by grain, molecule by molecule, the outermost skin of Europa is quietly chipped away and dispersed, some of it lost forever to space, some of it falling gently back to settle once again, and so the result is a top layer that is constantly being erased and rewritten, endlessly refreshed by the very storm that erodes it, a surface always being remade. The 157th fact is that delicate organic molecules, the fragile carbon-based chains that interest us most when we go searching for the signs of life, would not last very long at all if they were left lying exposed upon that heavily irradiated surface. The particles break them apart, scramble their careful structure, and leave behind only simpler and far less telling fragments of what was once there. Anything meaningful that rose from the ocean and froze into the crust would slowly be scrubbed of its story by the sky above. So a future lander could not simply scoop the top and expect answers. It would need to dig. The 158th fact is that the good news, quietly encouraging to everyone who thinks about these things, is that the shelter required may not be deep at all, because water ice is an excellent absorber of these particles and the radiation loses its strength remarkably quickly with depth. Only a modest distance below the surface, well within reach of a small drill or a gently heated probe, the environment becomes quiet and calm enough that fragile molecules of that kind could survive for a very long time indeed. What lies just under that scoured and battered skin may well hold everything the top has lost. A library beneath the scratched cover. The 159th fact is that Europa does not receive this bombardment evenly at all, because the moon keeps one face turned toward Jupiter as it travels and therefore has a leading hemisphere that plows forward and a trailing one that follows quietly along behind. The charged particles, circling around Jupiter faster than the moon itself travels, sweep predominantly onto that trailing side, weathering it more heavily and painting it with a different chemistry. Astronomers can see the difference quite plainly in the color and in the spectra of reflected light. One face reddened and altered, the other cleaner and brighter. Two faces of a single world. The 160th fact is that there is a strange and undeniable beauty in a place so hostile and so utterly still, where nothing decays, nothing rusts, nothing blows away, and every crack once recorded in the ice remains perfectly legible for ages afterward. It is a landscape that punishes machines without mercy and would swiftly end the life of an unprotected visitor. And yet it is also serene beyond describing, bathed in soft, distant sunlight and the great striped face of Jupiter hanging overhead. All of it is hundreds of millions of kilometers away from your pillow tonight, entirely unable to reach you, harmless and quietly magnificent. The 161st fact is that our first real look at Europa came from the two Voyager spacecraft, which swept through the Jupiter system and turned their cameras briefly toward a small bright moon that no telescope here on Earth had ever properly resolved into a disk. What came back astonished everyone who saw it. A smooth white ball laced with dark lines, quite unlike any surface previously imagined. There were no craters to speak of and no mountains at all. Only long curving stripes crossing an almost polished globe. Humanity had, in a matter of hours, met an entirely new kind of place, glimpsed in passing and never forgotten. The 162nd fact is that those very few images changed Europa from a faint point of light in a telescope eyepiece into a genuine world with geography, with regions and features that could be named and argued over and studied for decades afterward. Before that brief encounter, it had been little more than a moving dot of light, one of the 4 small sparks that Galileo noticed centuries earlier. Afterward, it was a landscape, a place with a face of its own, a proper subject for careful maps and patient study. That is one of the quiet gifts of exploration, turning dots into worlds, a point becoming a place. The 163rd fact is that the Galileo spacecraft followed the Voyagers and did what they never could, settling into orbit around Jupiter and staying there from 1995 until 2003, circling patiently for years on end rather than merely passing by in a rush. Staying changes absolutely everything, because a visitor who lingers in a place sees the seasons turn, repeats measurements, revisits the same terrain from different angles, and gathers the slow evidence that a single flyby can never provide. Almost everything we understood about Europa before this present decade came to us from that one small and persistent machine, a long and faithful residency. The 164th fact is that Galileo suffered a serious wound before it had ever arrived, because its large main antenna, folded up like an umbrella for the long journey outward, never fully opened when commanded, leaving several of its ribs stubbornly stuck in place. That antenna was to have carried images home in a flood. Without it, the mission faced the real prospect of returning almost nothing at all, and for a while it seemed the whole enterprise might be reduced to a handful of measurements. It was, by any measure, a heartbreaking moment for the people who had built it, a door that would not open. The 165th fact is that what followed is one of the finest stories in the whole history of exploration, because the engineers simply refused to give up and instead rebuilt the entire mission around the small low-gain antenna that still worked perfectly well. They wrote entirely new compression software and sent it out across the whole solar system. They improved and linked together the great receiving stations here on Earth, and they chose with enormous care which pictures were truly worth the wait. Data trickled home slowly and patiently after that, sometimes a single image arriving over the course of many hours, salvaged by sheer human stubbornness. The 166th fact is that despite that very narrow pipe, Galileo managed a series of remarkably close passes over Europa and returned by far the finest images of its cracked surface that we still possess even now, several decades later. Some of those frames show terrain at a scale where individual blocks of ice, tilted and rotated and refrozen in place, are plainly visible to the eye. Those same pictures are still being studied today, still yielding fresh arguments and new insights, still printed in new papers. A handful of hard-won photographs became the foundation of an entire field of study, few in number and priceless in value. The 167th fact is that the most important discovery of all came not from a camera at all but from a magnetometer, a quiet little instrument whose only task was measuring magnetic fields, which noticed that Europa disturbs Jupiter's own field in a very particular and repeatable way as it passes through. The precise pattern of that disturbance matched what a large deep shell of salty, electrically conducting liquid would produce, and matched nothing else at all convincingly, and so in that subtle wobble of a single needle lay the strongest evidence we have that a great ocean lies beneath the ice, a sea revealed by magnetism. The 168th fact is that when Galileo's fuel eventually ran low and its systems had aged badly under years of relentless radiation, the mission was not simply switched off and left abandoned to drift forever in orbit. Instead, the team steered the spacecraft deliberately into Jupiter itself, sending it down into those enormous clouds where it burned away completely in a matter of a few brief moments. Engineers gathered together in a quiet control room watched the final signals slowly fade away, knowing exactly what they had chosen. It was a deliberate ending, planned years in advance, and carried out with something close to ceremony. A farewell gently given. The 169th fact is that the reason for that particular ending was planetary protection, the guiding principle that we must not contaminate a world which might one day be found to harbor life entirely of its own. An abandoned spacecraft, drifting on for centuries with nobody left alive to steer it, could one day eventually strike Europa and carry down hardy earthly microbes, sleeping in its crevices, into water we had not yet studied. To lose that precious chance through nothing more than simple carelessness was unacceptable to everyone involved. So Galileo was deliberately sacrificed in order to keep a distant ocean pristine. An act of genuine respect. The 170th fact is that the Europa Clipper is the largest spacecraft that has ever yet been built for a planetary mission of any kind, a machine of really considerable size and mass, carrying a complete suite of scientific instruments and a great deal of fuel for the many long maneuvers that still lie ahead of it. Its great scale reflects the sheer difficulty of the task ahead, because reaching Jupiter, surviving there, and studying an entire moon in detail all demand power, shielding, and patience in generous measure. It is a serious and expensive answer to a very serious question. Built large because it must be. The 171st fact is that the Clipper spreads enormous solar wings, larger than those of any craft the agency has flown before, because sunlight at Jupiter's great distance is only a very small fraction of the sunlight that falls so gently upon the Earth. In order to gather enough energy from that thin and scattered light, the panels themselves must be generous indeed, unfolding slowly after launch into great flat shining surfaces that stretch far out to either side of the body. When it is fully extended, the whole spacecraft is wider across than a basketball court, a delicate winged thing crossing the enormous dark, gathering a faint and distant sun. The 172nd fact is that the Europa Clipper left the Earth on the 14th of October of 2024, rising up through our atmosphere on a bright and steady column of flame and then settling into the long silence of interplanetary space. Years of design, argument, testing, and quiet worry all ended in a few very loud and trembling minutes. For everyone who had worked upon it, the launch was both a triumph and a strange kind of parting, watching something you built with your hands depart forever. It will never come home to us again, and it was never meant to. Sent away with love. The 173rd fact is that the route out to Jupiter is not a straight line at all but a long looping cruise, because no rocket that we have could throw so heavy a spacecraft directly outward with anything like enough speed to arrive. Instead, the Clipper swings out past Mars, taking a little energy away from that planet's own motion, and then curves back inward again to pass the Earth once more for a second gravitational push. Each of those encounters costs nothing whatever in fuel and gains a great deal in velocity. It is a slow and rather elegant kind of thrift, borrowing speed from passing worlds. The 174th fact is that the arrival is expected in April of 2030, when the spacecraft will fire its main engine for a long and very carefully measured burn and allow Jupiter's gravity to capture it gently into orbit. That one single maneuver must work perfectly and correctly the very first time, with no possibility at all of a second attempt. After all those long years of quiet coasting through the dark, somewhere back on Earth a room full of quiet people will hold their breath, waiting for a signal that has already been traveling for the better part of an hour. A long, quiet wait. The 175th fact is that the Clipper will orbit Jupiter itself rather than Europa directly, which sounds at first like a very strange choice until you remember those radiation belts wrapped so tightly around the giant planet. A spacecraft parked permanently in orbit around Europa itself would sit inside the very worst of that particle storm continuously, and would almost surely fail within a few short months of its arriving. By looping widely around Jupiter instead, and only ducking briefly into the harsh inner zone, then retreating outward again to rest and to send its gathered data home, It survives very much longer, visiting rather than staying. The 176th fact is that the mission plans some 49 close flybys of Europa, each one of them skimming over a different band of the surface below, some of them passing very low indeed above the ice. Taken all together, those many passes will map nearly the entire moon at good resolution, stitching a single global portrait out of dozens of narrow, overlapping ribbons. Each single encounter is brief, only a few intense hours of measurement, followed by long, quiet weeks of slow and steady transmission back to Earth. Patience of that kind is built into the very shape of the plan, gathered slowly, pass by pass. The 177th fact is that the instruments carried aboard the spacecraft were each chosen to answer specific questions, and among them is an ice-penetrating radar designed to send radio waves down through the crust and then listen very carefully for the faint echo returning from whatever it is that lies beneath. There are cameras for taking detailed pictures of the terrain below, and spectrometers to read the chemistry of the surface materials themselves. There is a magnetometer to measure the ocean's magnetic signature far more precisely, and a dust analyzer to taste the tiny grains lifted up from the ice, each one asking its own question. The 178th fact is that the Europa Clipper is not traveling alone in spirit, because the European mission named JUICE departed the Earth in April of 2023, bound chiefly for Ganymede, which is the largest moon anywhere in the whole solar system. Its own long and winding path through the Jupiter system will nonetheless carry it past Europa several times along the way, allowing it to gather its own independent measurements of that bright icy face. 2 continents, 2 space agencies, and 2 separate spacecraft, all of them aimed at the same distant family of worlds, arriving within the same handful of years. The 179th fact is that having 2 spacecraft in one system at the same time is worth a great deal more than simply twice a single mission, because they can measure the very same thing from 2 entirely different places at the very same moment, which is something that no lone traveler could ever manage alone. One of them can sit out in the open magnetic field while the other flies directly through the moon's thin veil, and together the 2 can separate real causes from mere coincidences. It is simply the difference between 1 witness and 2, a far fuller account of the same event. The 180th fact is that we still have not landed upon Europa, and the reasons are honest ones: the punishing radiation, the wholly unknown terrain that might be a smooth open plain or a forest of jagged blades, the very great cost, and the plain duty to sterilize very thoroughly anything at all we set down there. Beyond all that still waits the dream of a cryobot, a patient probe that would melt its own slow way down through many kilometers of ice toward the sea below. It is still decades away, begun by people who may never live to see it finished. And still they begin. The 181st fact is that the question everyone truly wants answered about Europa is whether anything is alive in that ocean. And the honest reply tonight is that nobody knows. We have never sampled the water. We have never seen beneath the ice. Every hopeful word written about life there rests on the presence of the ingredients rather than on any evidence of the thing itself. Scientists are careful about this, and rightly so, because the question is far too interesting to answer carelessly. What we can say is that Europa is not obviously hostile to life in the way most of the solar system is, and that is already a remarkable thing to be able to say. The 182nd fact is that if life does exist in that hidden sea, nearly everyone who studies the matter expects it would be small and simple, something closer to bacteria than to anything you could see without a microscope, gathered perhaps in soft films around the warm places on the seafloor, or drifting slowly through the deep water in enormous faint clouds. On Earth, single-celled life appeared very early and then ruled alone for billions of years before anything more complicated arrived. Simplicity is not a disappointment. A single living cell in another world's ocean would be the most extraordinary discovery in the history of our species, and it would change everything gently. The 183rd fact is that people often ask whether there could be fish or something larger still, swimming in the dark down there? And the careful answer is that it seems unlikely, though not impossible. Large animals need a great deal of energy, and Europa's ocean receives no sunlight at all. So every calorie would have to come from chemistry seeping out of the rock below. That is a thin and frugal budget compared with the sunlit abundance of our own seas. Still, the deep vents of Earth support crowds of surprisingly large creatures on exactly that kind of chemistry. So nobody says never, only quietly, probably not. The 184th fact is that the deepest reason to look at all is what a discovery there would mean for the rest of the universe. If life began twice in a single solar system, independently in two places as unlike as a warm blue planet and a frozen moon, then life is almost certainly not a rare accident. It would mean that wherever water and rock and a little warmth come together anywhere among the stars, something is likely stirring. That single result would turn the sky from an empty place into a crowded one, and it might be waiting under 15 kilometers of ice. The 185th fact is that finding nothing at all would be nearly as profound as finding something. If we one day sample that ocean thoroughly, and it proves to be a beautiful sterile sea of salt water, warm and chemically rich and utterly lifeless, we will have learned that having the ingredients is not enough, and that the beginning of life is a rarer step than we hoped. Either answer is enormous. There is no version of this exploration that teaches us nothing. That is a rare thing in science, and the people who work on Europa know it, and it keeps them patient. The 186th fact is that there are 3 ways we might eventually find out, and all of them are slow. We could fly a spacecraft through one of the plumes and taste the spray, which is by far the easiest. We could land gently on the ice and scoop up material from just below the surface, where the radiation has not yet destroyed everything delicate. Or we could send something that melts its way down through the whole crust and swims free in the water beneath, which is the dream and the hardest thing anyone has ever proposed. A machine sent down into a sea to listen. The 187th fact is that whatever we send must be scrupulously clean, because the worst possible outcome would be to find life on Europa and then discover it came from us. Earthly microbes are astonishingly tough, and a few of them survive vacuum, cold, and radiation for long stretches. Every craft bound for that moon is built in filtered rooms and baked or chemically treated to reduce what it carries. This is why the Galileo spacecraft was deliberately steered into Jupiter at the end of its life. We are trying very hard to keep one ocean unspoiled, a courtesy extended across half the solar system. The 188th fact is that it is worth imagining, for a little while, what it would be like to stand on that ice yourself. Beneath your boots, the surface would be pale and slightly blue where it is thick, glass-hard and faintly grooved, dusted in places with a fine bright frost that would puff up in slow motion at every step and take a long, long time to settle again. Your footprints would stay there for millions of years. The ground would not crunch because there would be no air to carry the sound, only the feel of it through your feet. The 189th fact is that the horizon would be startlingly close, curving away much sooner than any horizon you have ever walked toward. On a world that size, the ground falls off quickly, and the edge of sight would sit near enough that you would feel yourself standing on a sphere rather than on a plane. Everything beyond that near white rim would simply be sky. Long dark lines would come up out of the ice behind you and run away over the curve ahead, straight and quiet, going somewhere you could not see, and the whole landscape would be lit like a winter dusk. The 190th fact is that the most overwhelming part of standing there would be the thing hanging above you. If you stood on the near side, Jupiter would fill an enormous portion of the sky, a banded amber wall of clouds so wide you could not take it in with one look, and it would never move at all. It would not rise. It would not set. You could sleep and wake and walk for days, and find it in precisely the same place, turning slowly upon itself while remaining perfectly fixed in the heavens. The stillest thing in that entire sky. The 191st fact is that the sky around Jupiter would not be empty either, for the other moons would be there, bright and moving. Io would pass by as a small orange spark, sometimes close enough to show a disk, and Ganymede and Callisto would drift along in the distance as steady pale points far brighter than anything in our own night. The sun would be there too, a small brilliant star, too fierce to look at and far too little to warm you. Everything would be sharp and clear and cold, with no air to soften anything. A sky of pure geometry quietly turning. The 192nd fact is that from time to time the great planet would swallow the sun entirely, and night would come to Europa in a way it never comes to us. Once every orbit the moon slips into Jupiter's shadow, and the small bright star vanishes behind that enormous dark disk, ringed for a moment by a thin glowing arc of sunlight bent through the giant's outer atmosphere. The temperature would fall. The ice would grow darker and quieter still. And then, a while later, the light would return exactly as it left. The longest, gentlest eclipse in the solar system. The 193rd fact is that the strangest thing of all, standing there, would be the silence. There is no air on Europa, and so there is nothing to carry sound of any kind. No wind, no rustle, no distant noise from anywhere. If the ice cracked open 100 paces from you, you would perhaps feel a faint shiver through your boots, and hear nothing whatsoever. And below all that silence, only a short distance down, an entire ocean would be moving, rising and falling with the tides, in a darkness that has never once been disturbed. An enormous sea you could not hear at all. The 194th fact is that this is the thought that stays with people longest, the idea that beneath your feet, beneath the ice, something might be moving in that water while you stand there quite unaware. It is not a frightening thought, only a very deep one. Whatever is down there, if anything is, does not know about us, has never seen a star, and has no notion at all that there is a sky. Its entire universe is warm, dark water with a ceiling of ice. And ours, seen properly, is not so very different. A small lit space inside a much larger dark. The 195th fact is that there is a gentle vertigo in remembering the size of it all, that a moon smaller than the one outside your window holds 2 to 3 times more liquid water than every ocean, sea, lake, and river of the earth combined. All the water you have ever swum in, all the rain that has ever fallen on you, every glass you have ever drunk, gathered together, would be a small fraction of what lies quietly under that ice tonight. The largest ocean in the solar system belongs to a little white moon, and no wave of it has ever seen the light. The 196th fact is that this has all been going on for an unimaginably long time without any witness whatsoever. For 4.5 billion years the tides have kneaded that moon. The ice has cracked and healed. The ocean has turned slowly over in the dark, and nothing anywhere knew about it. It went on through the whole of Earth's history, through the first cells and the first forests, through every creature that has ever lived and died here. It was going on while you were born and while you learned to walk, and it is going on now while you rest. The 197th fact is that perhaps the loveliest thing Europa offers is not an answer but a question we are allowed to keep. We do not know what is down there. We may not know within our lifetimes. And there is something unexpectedly restful in a mystery that nobody needs you to solve, that will be handed gently to whoever comes next, and to whoever comes after them. Not every open question is a burden. Some of them are simply a warm light left on at the far edge of what we know, and it will still be burning in the morning. The 198th fact is that nothing at all is being asked of you now. The ice will go on flexing whether you are awake or asleep. The ocean will keep its slow tide. and Jupiter will hang motionless above that pale ground through every hour of your rest and every hour after. None of it requires your attention. Let your shoulders drop a little further into the bed. Let your hands grow loose and heavy. Let the last unfinished business of the day drift off somewhere it can wait until morning. There is only your breathing left to look after, and even that goes on by itself. The 199th fact is that as your thoughts soften and blur, you might let yourself sink slowly downward, through the smooth, bright ice, past the long, quiet cracks and the frozen blue depths, until you come out into the enormous dark water below. There is no cold there in the mind's version of it, and no fear, and no weight at all, only a vast and silent sea rocking very gently, warmed from beneath by an ancient stone floor. Far above, the ice glows faintly with the last of the light. Let yourself drift down into that stillness now, slowly and easily and without effort. The 200th fact is that long after this night is over, and long after all our nights are over, Europa will still be circling Jupiter in the cold, its white face turned patiently toward the giant, its hidden ocean rising and falling in the dark exactly as it does above you now. So let the last of the day dissolve, and let your thoughts grow quiet and slow, and drift out with that small bright moon into the deep and gentle silence between the worlds. Rest now, sleep well, and thank you for drifting with me beyond the stars.